They gave me a chair. That surprised me more than anything else about the day. The fact that after everything, after the vote, after the transit pod, and the armed escort, and the 3 airlocks cycling one after another, like the chambers of a very bureaucratic gun, somebody on the Verath Conclave staff had thought to bring a chair. It was too small for a human, of course. The Verath build their furniture the way they build their arguments. Narrow, rigid, no allowance for variation. No consideration that any body shaped differently from theirs might one day occupy the same space. I sat in it anyway. I squared my shoulders, folded my hands on my knees, and looked out at 11,000 alien delegates arranged in ascending concentric rings around me. Every pale face angled down at the floor of the permanent chamber where one human physicist sat, with his jacket still buttoned and his back straight. And I thought about Maddie. I thought about the kitchen in Reykjavik. I thought about the first night the cards wouldn't fall. You deserve to know how we got there. All of it, from the beginning. The kitchen, to the Senate floor of the Conclave's central station, which they call the Permanent Chamber, a name that strikes me now as darkly funny, given what happened inside it. I'll try to be accurate. The details matter in science, and whatever else this story is, it is at its core a story about science. About what science is for. About what happens when the people who have decided what is real encounter evidence that their decision was made without full information. My name is Elias Cade. I am a quantum physicist, or I was before the designation became complicated by events. My wife is Dr. Madeline Cade née Farrow. We met at Cambridge in our doctoral years, at a department seminar where she gave a presentation on entanglement coherence decay, and I interrupted with a question that she later described as technically correct but insufferably timed. We argued for 40 minutes after the seminar ended and had coffee the following morning. We married the week after we both submitted our dissertations, which the department chair called the most efficient scheduling he'd seen in 40 years of academia. He meant it as a joke. We took it as a compliment. We have always been efficient people. We were posted to the Reykjavik Quantum Research Facility in 2141, 3 years after first contact and 18 months after humanity had signed the provisional accession agreement with the Verath Conclave. The agreement gave us access to their trade lanes, their translation protocols, their medical indices, and the broader conclave network that connected 47 member civilizations across the arm of the galaxy, the Verath called the Settled Band. In exchange, we shared our data archives, art, language, history, our complete scientific record up to the signing date. The CAM's archivists spent 6 weeks processing 4,000 years of human documentation. Their official summary described humanity's scientific achievement as earnest but pre-formative. The diplomat who delivered that assessment to Secretary General Okafor did so without apparent irony. Okafor thanked him through clenched teeth and had strong opinions about it in private for several years afterward. We were not yet equals in anyone's estimation but our own. This matters for understanding what came later. The Verath Conclave is 400 years old. In 400 years of expansion and negotiation, and the enormous slow machinery of multi-species governance, they had developed a working model of what a new civilization looks like when it contacts them. What it knows, what it doesn't know, where it fits in the existing structure. Humanity, by every metric they applied, looked like a species that was approximately 300 years behind the Conclave's founding members in physics, 200 years behind in biology, and about 50 years ahead in applied mathematics, which they found mildly interesting. We were scheduled to be brought up to speed, gradually managed, incorporated. The way you incorporate a new region into an existing system, carefully, patiently, with great confidence that you know what you're doing. They were not wrong to be confident. They had done it 46 times before. The Reykjavik facility had been running quantum superposition experiments for 11 years before I arrived. Good work. Solid work. The kind of methodical, grinding science that doesn't produce headlines but fills in the foundational gaps that headlines depend on. I'd read every paper the team had published. I'd cited half of them in my own doctoral work. When Director Chen offered me the lead position on the phase coherence team, I said yes before she'd finished the sentence. Maddie took the adjacent role on the entanglement dynamics team, which meant our offices shared a wall, and we could argue through it by raising our voices, which we did several times a week, and which the rest of the corridor regarded as a reliable indicator of productive science. The facility was housed in a converted geothermal research station on the Reykjanes Peninsula, all exposed concrete and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at lava fields that never quite looked real in any weather. We ate lunch in the facility canteen, which served inexplicably exceptional ramen, a mystery I never solved and eventually stopped trying to. We walked the lava fields on weekends when the wind was manageable. Maddie kept a pot of something on the kitchen windowsill that was supposed to be a succulent, but had never looked entirely healthy. We were in the ordinary, unremarkable way that describes the happiest periods of most lives, content. I want you to understand this before I tell you the rest. We were not rebels. We were not activists. We were not conducting research with any particular agenda about humanity's place in the galactic order or what we deserved, or what the Verath owed us. We were two physicists doing physics. One of us happened to be an amateur magician. I've been doing card tricks since I was 12. My grandfather, who had spent 30 years as a structural engineer and retired into a deep and satisfied eccentricity, taught me the basics: false shuffles, palms, the double lift, the mechanics of misdirection. He taught them with the same meticulous patience he'd brought to everything, showing me how each effect worked, and then explaining why it worked. The gap between perception and reality that every trick exploits. I never stopped. In university, I added sleight-of-hand flourishes. In my doctoral years, I could run a full stage routine, though I rarely did. In Reykjavik, I kept a deck in my desk drawer and worked through sequences when my mind needed something for my hands to do, while the deeper thinking happened underneath. It's a useful hobby for a physicist. Magic and physics are the same discipline, approached from opposite directions. The magician exploits the gap between what the eye sees and what is actually happening. The physicist tries to close it. I always thought a man who could do both had a reasonably complete picture of reality. I know now that was insufferably naive. It was also in the specific way that useful naivety tends to be productive. The night everything changed, we had brought work home. We did this often. Less because the facility didn't have enough hours in it, and more because the apartment had better coffee, and no one scheduled meetings there. Maddie was wrestling with an anomaly in her entanglement data. A coherent signature in a pair of particles that had no business being coherent. The particles had been separated by 40 meters of reinforced concrete and double-shielded cabling, insulated against every mechanism of interaction that the established physics of entanglement allowed for. Churi. By every measurement, they should have been independent. By Maddie's data, they were behaving as if they were still in the same room, still part of the same quantum state. Still, this was her word, said out loud at the kitchen table for the first time that evening, listening to each other. She'd been staring at it for 9 hours. Coffee had gone cold 3 times, and she'd reheated it 3 times without noticing. This is how I know she was genuinely stuck, because Maddie notices cold coffee. I made tea. I pulled out a deck of cards. Old habit. My thinking hands needing something to hold. I ran through the basics, the false cut, the controlled shuffle, the palm, the spread, slowly, not performing, just moving. Particular meditative state that comes from doing something your body knows completely, while your mind works on something else. I was running through a spread, the deck fanned in one hand, face down, when Maddie said, without looking up, "Elias, cards." I looked at my hands. The deck was hovering, not dramatically, not cinematically, not rising toward the ceiling or spinning or emitting light or doing any of the things that the word levitation suggests when you hear it for the first time. Just hovering. The bottom card 6 inches above my palm. The rest of the deck fanned above it in the exact configuration I'd been holding, as suspended if time had paused at the peak of the spread and simply forgotten to let gravity resume. My hands were open. Both of them. Flat fingers relaxed, nothing touching the cards. I'm a physicist. First response to impossible things is not wonder. Wonder comes later, if at all, and usually only after the measurements are complete. First thought was mechanism. There has to be a mechanism. Something I'm not seeing. some aspect of the setup I haven't accounted for. I stood absolutely still, the way you stand when you've encountered something unexpected in a laboratory and movement risks, disturbing a condition you won't be able to replicate. Maddie had come around the table. She was 2 feet away, leaning forward slightly, and her face had gone the particular pale that I recognized from the moment she'd first seen her entanglement anomaly. The face of a scientist confronting data that has no available framework, data that is real and measurable, and completely without theoretical address. The deck drifted sideways, 4 inches, deliberate, and then back to center. Not in response to any air current. The windows were closed, the ventilation was passive. Not in response to any mechanism I could identify. In response, I noticed, with a feeling I can only describe as the simultaneous arrival of certainty and disorientation to my intention. I thought left, the deck moved left. When I thought still, the deck stilled. Note the time, I said. My voice was level. I was at that moment genuinely proud of that. I already did, Maddie said. I heard her pen scratch on her notebook. It occurred to me that this was one of the reasons I'd married her. We spent the next 4 hours documenting it. Discipline of those 4 hours, the care we took, the controls we tried to establish, the methodical refusal to draw any conclusion faster than the data warranted, is still, I think, some of the best scientific work I've ever done, which is saying something given that the thing we were studying involved me floating household objects across a kitchen with my thoughts. We tested different objects. The pen moved, the coffee mug moved, 1/2 inch, then 2 inches, then 6. The plate from the dish rack moved in a full arc, and I set it down gently on the counter. Each displacement was measured. Each attempt was recorded. We established that the effect varied with my focus, that it was repeatable within a session, that it degraded when I was tired, and that it had an effective range of approximately 3 meters. Around 2 in the morning, Maddie sat back in her chair with the notebook open on the table between us and said, "The coherence signature. In my entanglement data, I weighted the 2 particles, the ones sharing a state across 40 meters of shielded concrete." She tapped the pen against her lips. "They're doing something analogous, not identical. The mechanism is different, the scale is different, but the pattern is the same. Something is maintaining coherence across a separation that should make coherence impossible. In their case, quantum state. In yours," she stopped. "In my case," I said, "attention." "Intention," she said, which was more precise, and I recognized this as her correcting me and accepted it. We looked at each other across the kitchen table, 4 hours into documentation, with a deck of 52 cards suspended 12 foot between us, because I had thought them there. And we understood, not in the sharp dramatic way of revelations in films, but in the slower, surer way of 2 people who have spent careers learning to trust data when data is unambiguous. That we were at the edge of something enormous. We wrote it up. That was the only thing to do. You encounter data. You document it. You submit it to the process that determines whether the data holds. Science is the process. The process is not glamorous, and it is not fast, and it frequently involves professional humiliation when your results are found wanting. But it is the only honest mechanism humans have developed for distinguishing what is true from what we want to be true. We trusted it, because we had spent our careers inside it and knew that its failures, when they occurred, were failures of people rather than failures of the method. Paper went to 5 journals simultaneously because Maddie insisted on redundancy, and because we both understood, without discussing it directly, that what we had written was going to be received as either the most important physics result in human history or as evidence of professional delusion. And we wanted to be on record in more than one place before the conversation about which one it was began. 4 of the journals declined within 72 hours. Slightly, quickly, in the professional language that means the editors had read the abstract and decided that whatever the results actually were, they did not want to be the venue that published them. The 5th journal, a small entanglement physics publication out of Seoul that had spent 20 years publishing careful, unfashionable work without apology, sent the paper to 2 reviewers. 3 weeks later, we had 2 responses. One was a detailed technical objection, serious and rigorous, that identified 4 areas where our methodology could be challenged. Maddie wrote a 12-page point-by-point rebuttal over a long weekend, addressing every objection with data, and in 2 cases, with additional experiments we ran in the 48 hours between draft and final submission. The other reviewer's response was a single sentence: "I have reproduced the primary result. Publish immediately." The paper published on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, Director Chen had read it. She called us into her office at 7:30 in the morning, which was before most of the facility was in. She had a printout of the abstract on her desk. She read it twice in our presence, slowly, with the careful, controlled expression of a woman who has been in science for 30 years and has developed excellent habits for the moments when something lands on her desk that could be either a breakthrough or a catastrophe. Then she looked up. "Show me," she said. I picked up the ceramic coffee mug from her desk. I set it back down. I opened my hand, palm up, and thawed it. The mug lifted. It rose to eye level, which put it roughly between Director Chen and me, and it held there, 7 inches above the desk surface, not wobbling, not drifting, simply present at the height I had placed it. Director Chen watched it. She breathed once carefully. Then I lowered the mug back to the desk. She was quiet for approximately 10 seconds. "Lock the building," she said. I was never certain whether she was talking to us or to herself. Then she reached for her secure line and called Geneva. Followed was 3 weeks of concentrated research that I have since come to think of as the most productive and most alarming of my career. Facility went to internal lockdown, full access restriction, no external communications without Director Chen's sign-off, all staff required to remain on site. 12 physicists, 4 mathematicians, 2 neurologists brought up from Reykjavik University, and a philosopher of science whose presence I never fully understood but whose questions were, in retrospect, the most useful ones anyone asked. Worked in 8-hour shifts around the clock, taking the data apart and reassembling it, testing every possible alternative explanation until they were exhausted, and then sitting with what remained. The testing of alternative explanations took 4 days. At the end of 4 days, we had eliminated equipment artifact, measurement error, personal bias, and 6 different categories of previously documented quantum effect that might have been mistaken for something novel. What remained was the novel thing. What we found, in the broadest terms that don't require a physics doctorate to follow. The quantum coherence mechanics underlying Maddie's entanglement anomaly were not an isolated laboratory phenomenon. They were a property of human neural architecture. Every human brain operates at a scale that had previously been too small and too brief to measure, in a state of continuous partial quantum entanglement with the observable field around it. The phrase, "the observable field," is imprecise, but let it stand. What I mean is the substrate, the underlying layer of physical reality that classical physics describes as fixed and Verath physics describes as consensus ratified. We had always been embedded in it. Our nervous systems had always been in a relationship with it. We had simply never had instruments sensitive enough to detect the relationship, and so we had not known to look for it, and so we had constructed a complete and internally consistent physics that treated the relationship as non-existent. The ability was latent. In the overwhelming majority of humans, it manifested as nothing more than a statistically marginal bias in decision-making. The intuition that makes you check the stove one more time, the sense of timing that good surgeons have, the navigational accuracy that long-distance sailors use to call feeling the sea. In a smaller subset of humans, for reasons we had hypotheses about but had not yet been able to confirm, the coherence was stronger, the channel was cleaner, and once you understood what the channel was, once you had the physics laid out clearly enough that your nervous system could recognize the signal it had been receiving all your life, the effect became something you could work with deliberately. I know this because on the 12th day of the lockdown study, Maddie sat across from me at the lab table with a pen lying between us and her hands flat on the surface and her eyes closed. And the pen slid 6 centimeters to the left. She opened her eyes, she looked at the pen, she looked at me. "Well," she said, "good." If it held for Maddie, whose coherence profile was measurably lower than mine, the data strongly suggested it would hold, at some threshold level, for many humans, perhaps for most. We had 3 weeks of working with that knowledge, before it escaped the building. Don't use the word escaped carelessly. The paper was already published. It was already in the record. What I mean is that the full scope of what the paper implied, not just the result but the replication. Not just the result and the replication but the 23 people in the facility who had now each demonstrated some level of the effect under controlled conditions. All of that was still inside the lockdown, still contained within 4 walls and 2 security checkpoints, and Director Chen's careful management of external communications. It escaped when the Verath Conclave's Intelligence Directorate completed their routine monitoring scan of human-origin scientific publications. I was told later that the flag went up within minutes of the scan completing. I was told that the response was classified as priority concordance, which is 2 levels below the Conclave's highest alert tier, and had not been invoked in relation to any human matter since first contact. I was not told any of this at the time. What I was told was 7 Conclave officials had arrived at the facility's main entrance and were requesting immediate access under the Provisional Agreement's inspection provisions. There were 5 Directorate officers in their standard gray and ochre field robes. There was a senior Conclave adjudicator, whose rank insignia I recognized from the agreement ceremonies 3 years earlier. And there was a Verath physicist whose name I have made a deliberate choice not to remember or record, because I disliked him within 4 minutes of our introduction. And my dislike has not diminished in the years since, and I see no reason to give him the permanence of documentation. They didn't knock. The inspection provisions don't require it. They walked in. They presented credentials to the security desk, and they were escorted to Director Chen's office. By the time we were informed, they'd arrived. The adjudicator's name was Verath. She was tall by Verath standards, approximately my height, with the elongated cranial structure and the large, fixed eyes that make Verath faces seem, to most humans, unreadable. I have learned, through many hours in many difficult rooms with many Verath officials, that this is wrong. They're not unreadable. They read differently. The signals are distributed differently across the body, weighted differently, timed differently. Verath's signals that first morning read clearly to me as controlled alarm. Not panic, controlled. The alarm of a professional who has encountered something outside their protocol and is managing the gap between what the protocol says and what the situation requires. She introduced herself and stated the inspection's purpose with precise economy. She asked for the research documentation. Chen handed over the external summary, 14 pages, and stated that the full documentation was several thousand pages and would require formal transfer protocols. Verath read the 14-page summary in 4 minutes, very fast for a Verath, who typically read consensus documents aloud in pairs as a verification mechanism. Then she set it on the table and looked directly at me. "Dr. Cade," she said. English was excellent. The slight flatness in the vowels that marks a Verath, who learned the language from recordings rather than from human speakers. "Is it your finding that this capability exists across the human population? The data suggests it's latent in all humans and active in varying degrees across the distribution we haven't fully mapped," I said. "We believe the capacity is universal. The expressed level varies significantly, and you believe it can be taught, deliberately transmitted. We've demonstrated it in 2 cases under controlled conditions. Theoretical framework suggests broader transmissibility, yes." She was silent. That working silence, that processing silence, that I was learning to read as something between loading and deciding. Then, "Thank you, Dr. Cade." She gathered her delegation and left. The call from Geneva came 4 hours later. The tone of the conversation told me everything before the words did. Not the content of the words, which were careful and diplomatic and laden with protocol language, but the pace and the register of the voice at the other end, which was the voice of a person trying to communicate urgency through vocabulary that didn't allow it. The Conclave had invoked Article 17 of the Provisional Agreement. 17 was a contingency provision for research with destabilizing intercivilizational potential, language that had been negotiated into the agreement by the Verath's legal team during the signing process, and accepted by humanities negotiators who had, reasonably, not anticipated any scenario in which it would apply to us. It allowed the conclave to request a formal research pause and a joint review panel. The request was technically voluntary. Declining it would constitute a violation of the agreement's good faith provisions. The Secretary General had, in the diplomatic language of the call, accepted the spirit of the request. We were frozen. Joint supervision took effect the next morning. Conclave officers at every lab entrance. Data servers behind conclave keyed encryption. External communications under directorate review. Imprisoned. The agreement didn't allow imprisonment. Just frozen. Just locked in place while the conclave decided what we were. Maddie and I sat in our apartment that evening for a long time without speaking. This happens sometimes between people who know each other well. Not silence from lack of things to say, but silence from having too many things to say. In the same moment, the words stacking up behind each other, and none of them willing to go first. Finally, she said, "They know what it means." "Yes," I said, "if it's in all of us. If it spreads the way the data suggests." The Verath built the conclave's physics. Every transit lane, every communication protocol, every treaty, every enforcement mechanism the conclave has. It all rests on physical constants that every member species agrees are non-negotiable. Fixed. Bedrock. The bedrock that humans can apparently think sideways through, I said. She was quiet again. Then they're afraid. Of course they are, I said. They should be. Not of us. They don't know that. No, I said, they don't. The joint review panel met for 4 months. Shh. I was interviewed 11 times. Across 6 different panels. 3 of them conducted in the Verath's primary diplomatic language, with a translator who was good but not perfect. Which meant that the precise nuances of my thoughts were almost certainly received differently than I intended them. I made note of this and adapted. The Verath physicist submitted a formal academic critique of our methodology. It was 40 pages. It was precisely wrong in 17 specific areas. Not vaguely wrong, not imprecisely wrong, but wrong in a way that required ignoring clearly stated experimental controls, and in 2 cases misquoting our own measurements in ways that the data file disproved immediately. Maddie wrote a 47-page point-by-point rebuttal in 10 days. She was cheerful throughout. She described it afterward as the most fun she'd had since the kitchen. The critique was not retracted. The rebuttal was not entered into the formal review record. I noted this. At the end of the 4 months, the Joint Review Panel issued a 22-page finding. Core recommendation was that humanity voluntarily submit the research to conclave custodianship for a minimum of 30 years, during which no further replication or dissemination would occur, pending a full stability assessment. 30 years. I read that number and I sat with it for a long time. I thought about what 30 years meant in the life of a scientific finding, in the life of a civilization, in the life of a species that had just discovered that its relationship with physical reality was not what it had believed. I thought about the people who had been in that lab with us. I thought about the 23 colleagues Maddie had quietly, carefully, not quite in violation of the joint supervision, begun talking to in the weeks since the lockdown. Not teaching, not formally demonstrating, just explaining the physics, the framework, the mechanism we'd mapped. 23 people who now knew what to listen for. I wrote the response myself. Director Chen reviewed it and made no changes. Geneva reviewed it and changed, respectfully declined to, are unable to accept, which softened one word and changed nothing of substance. We were not accepting the recommendation. The conclave called a Senate session. The vote was, as I mentioned at the start of this account, 11,047 in favor of the Emergent Threat Stabilization Protocol, 0 opposed, and 12 abstentions. Unanimous by every practical measure. The enforcement teams arrived at 22 facilities within 60 hours. Equipment was bonded. Our data was locked. 41 colleagues were placed under informational restriction. I was named primary disclosing party and given 14 days to present myself at the permanent chamber. Maddie wanted to come. I said no, and I gave her the practical reason. Someone undesignated needed to stay and work. And this was true, and it was also not the complete reason. The complete reason was that I had spent the 14 days between the designation and my departure, thinking about the chamber, the 11,000 delegates, the chair that I suspected would be too small, and the single argument that I believed would work. Not an argument made in words. An argument made in the language the conclave would find genuinely difficult to counter. Because it is the only language in which the speaker and the evidence are the same thing. Shh. I needed to walk in alone. Maddie understood this before I finished explaining it. She kissed me at the transit terminal and said, "Don't do anything I wouldn't do." I told her she would do everything I was planning to do. She said yes, that was what she meant. Don't hold back. The transit takes 9 days. I spent the first 3 sleeping. I spent the next 6 at the cabin table with the cards in my hands and the star field outside the porthole, running calculations I had been working on since the weeks after the kitchen. Pressure testing a proposition I had begun to believe was true, but had not yet had occasion to test at scale. Permanent chamber, foundational stone underfoot, cold through the boot soles, tantric rings of curved Verath narrow seating, ascending to a transparent dome, the stars visible, one small human transit vessel in the outer berth, holographic, displays around the chamber walls showing the case file in Verath notation. Everything slightly too narrow. Everything designed to make you feel provisional. I sat in the chair. Verath Vel, Adjudicator General, 60 years in the role, opened proceedings with the case file recitation, designation, vote tally, protocol invocation, the 3 specific charges. His voice had the particular quality that very old authority develops. Not loud, not threatening, simply indifferent to the possibility of disagreement. He looked at me at the end of the recitation and told me I had 12 minutes. I stood up. A deck of cards. Standard 52. I'd brought it from Reykjavik, the same deck from the kitchen. I held it flat on my palm, face up, so the cameras and every eyes in the chamber could see it clearly. An ordinary object. No mechanisms. No preparation beyond what I'd been practicing for 9 days in a transit cabin. I said my piece. Said it simply and without performance. Because performance would have looked like desperation, and desperation would have been false. I told them the vote was irrelevant, not because I disrespected the conclave's process, but because the process, in this case, had been applied to something that doesn't respond to process. You can vote on what is allowed. You cannot vote on what is true. I opened my hand. The deck didn't fall. 11,000 Verath delegates. The Verath do not gasp. They don't have that reflex. It's not part of their respiratory architecture. What they have instead is a consensus lock, a simultaneous stilling of every body in the room as their shared perception architecture encounters input that it cannot ratify. It is, I'm told, involuntary. The Verath who have described it to me since use the word stop. Perception stops, briefly, at the gap between what is registered and what the consensus says is possible. 11,000 beings going absolutely still. Except the faint hum of the chamber's atmospheric systems, and the soft creak of Verath Vel's seat as he very slightly sat forward. I let the deck hang. 3 seconds. Then I spread it. The cards fanning open in a perfect arc, face up, all 52 visible, rotating 1 slow revolution. 3 more seconds. Then I gathered it back and set it on the chair behind me. And I told them what the 14 months of work meant, and what Maddie had done in the 6 days before I left, and what was already happening. I sat back down. I have used approximately 3 minutes, I said. I'm finished. The silence that followed was different from the stilling silence. That had been involuntary and brief. The system encountering something outside the ledger. Things. This was working silence. The sound of 11,000 consensus architecture minds processing new data, which they cannot do individually, which happens only collectively, which takes time. I sat and waited. The stars moved outside the dome. The transit vessel in the outer berth sat in its berth. Verath on, in the second ring, 3rd seat from the left, did not look away from me. Verath Vel spoke when he was ready. He ordered me to remain in station custody pending the conclave's assessment. I said, of course. A functionary came to the floor eventually and escorted me out. I was given a room, better than the chair, with a window that showed the outer berth and my transit vessel, and the star field beyond it. And I slept well. The 6 weeks that followed are documented in detail elsewhere. The emergency sessions, the convening of the Verath Science Directorate, for the first time in 40 years. The extraordinary admission, presented in the conclave's formal language as a revised foundational assessment. that the established physics on which the conclave's entire operational structure rested had been based on incomplete information about the universe's coherent substrate. The concession in that same document that the emergent threat stabilization protocol had been applied to a phenomenon that the protocol's definitions had not designed to address. In plain language, they had tried to lock away something that was already loose, and the lock, as I had told them, had never fit the door. I was released on a Tuesday morning. Verath On processed the release herself. She handed me the documentation and said, "Dr. Cade, adjudicator on," I said. She was quiet in the way she has when something she's been processing has reached completion. Then, the 12 abstentions. "I've thought about them," I said. Those 12 delegates registered uncertainty because their consensus percept architecture had flagged anomalous readings in the probability field surrounding human research facilities, approximately 8 months before your paper published. The readings were logged as equipment variants. She paused. "They were not equipment variants." "No," I said. "I know." She looked at me for a moment. "Shh. How long has this been occurring in your population? Spontaneous coherence events." I thought about my grandfather's hands, patient on a deck of cards. I thought about the small accumulated evidence of a species that had been embedded in the quantum substrate since before it had words for quantum anything. The intuition, the timing, the sense that long-distance sailors have of feeling the sea. The inexplicable accuracy of a surgeon who says afterward that she just knew. I thought about how much of human history might read differently if you knew to look for this. "We're not certain," I said, "possibly always." Verath On was very still for a moment. "That is a significant piece of information." "Yes," I said, "I know. I took the transit home alone. 9 days from Al Sapin, same porthole. Different stars, different angle on the galaxy. I sat with the understanding of what had happened and what it meant and what was going to be required next. Not by the conclave, not by Geneva, not by any external pressure. Required by the nature of what the data said. "You cannot put this back. You were never supposed to." Shh. We opened the research. Recklessly. Maddie designed the joint oversight structure herself, a multi-species panel that took 2 years to stand up properly, and is still the only body I trust to make decisions about the pace of the program. But we opened it. Because that is what science requires, and because the alternative was a galactic community that had spent its first decade of contact with humanity in a posture of fear, and we did not want to live in that community. Fear. The Verath would not have been wrong to be afraid of what we had, if we had been the kind of species that uses what we have to threaten. We were not. We needed them to see that, and the only way to make them see it was to show them. Maddie led the first multi-species research team. 6 humans, 4 Verath. 1 Soldran representative who had been watching the entire episode with what I can only describe as professional interest. The Soldran had their own anomaly data, as it turned out. Something in their low-light sensory architecture that had been generating coherence-adjacent readings for decades. Their scientists had classified it as measurement drift. It was not measurement drift. That is a separate story, and I leave it for Maddie to tell, because she is already writing it. The Verath physicist, who had submitted the methodology critique, published a public correction. It was adequately thorough. Maddie wrote him a generous reply. I did not. The 23 people Maddie talked to in those 6 days. Before my departure, I've spent the past 3 years helping build a training program that has now worked with over 40,000 participants on 6 continents. The distribution curve is wide and still being mapped. The baseline effect, the minimum threshold that appears in nearly every tested individual, is proving more universal than our most optimistic early models suggested. We always believed the capacity was broadly human. The data is confirming it. My daughter is 2 years old. Name is Rowan. I have not run entanglement experiments on her, because she is 2 years old, and that is not a thing you do, but she does something with the mobile above her crib. Small displacements, random seeming, within the range of what statistical noise can explain. I watch it, I note the time. I do not draw conclusions from 2 data points. I watch her and I think about a kitchen in Reykjavik, and 42 cards hanging in the air, and the particular face of a scientist confronting something that has no framework yet. We are still building the framework. That is the work. It will take longer than I have, longer than Maddie has, longer probably than Rowan will have. That is fine. The best frameworks are built slowly, with many hands, with argument and revision, and the willingness to be wrong and start again. This one will be built across species, which makes it slower still, and more important. Verath retired 6 months after the stability hearing. His successor issued a communication to the Earth Diplomatic Office last year, requesting access to the training program for 12 Verath volunteers who had come forward of their own accord. I read the communication 4 times before I was certain I understood it. I understood it. I wrote the reply that evening. 1 sentence. Yes. Maddie read it when I showed her. She made no changes. A version of this story where the Conclave's enforcement action held, where the locks worked, and the keys stayed locked, and the 41 restricted researchers chose silence for 30 years. And the world moved on without knowing what had been found. I have thought about that version with some care. The science would have emerged eventually. True things have a way of getting found, because the universe does not alter structure to accommodate suppressions of information about it. But there would have been 30 years of not knowing, 30 years of a species walking around in a relationship with physical reality that it did not understand. Because 11,000 beings on a station 40 light years away had voted that it was safer for everyone if humanity stayed in the dark. Presumption in that is what I find most difficult to forgive. Not the fear. Fear is reasonable when you encounter something large and unfamiliar. Not even the vote, which is the mechanism the conclave civilization runs on, but the presumption that the vote could settle it. That what is real waits for ratification. That the ledger is the final authority on what exists. It is not. It never was. That is the thing. I stood on the foundational stone floor to demonstrate, with a deck of cards and 3 minutes of a 12-minute allotment, to humiliate them, not to win, to show them something true that they had been unable to see, in the only language that doesn't require translation. Some arguments you can't make with words. Some evidence you can only be. My grandfather used to say that the difference between a trick and a miracle is the audience's theory of what's possible. Change the theory, and the same action becomes something else entirely. He was talking about card magic. He was, though neither of us knew it at the time, also talking about physics. I still have the deck. The same 52 cards from the kitchen in Reykjavik, slightly worn now at the edges, the box held together with a rubber band. Rowan reaches for it when it's on the table within her range. I let her hold it sometimes, the weight of it in her small hands. She looks at it, the way children look at things they can't name yet but recognize. I don't know what she recognizes. I have theories, I note the time. I want to go back and describe the 4 months of the joint review in more detail. Because those 4 months are where the shape of everything that followed was determined. Not in the permanent chamber, not in the enforcement action, not in any single dramatic moment, but in the slow, grinding, airless machinery of a process that was designed to reach a conclusion it had already reached before it started. The Conclave's review panels operate on what they call the integrated assessment principle. This is the principle that any finding of civilizational significance must be evaluated not by any single expert body, but by a chain of bodies, each of which reviews the previous body's findings and adds its own analysis. The whole stack then ratified by the Senate. It is a process designed to prevent hasty decisions. It is also a process that is extremely difficult to influence from the outside, because by the time any individual panel completes its work, the overall direction of the assessment has already been established by the panels that came before it, and each new panel is reading the previous panel's findings as much as it is reading the original evidence. We were not, in any meaningful sense, part of the process. We were the subject of it. Found out, 3 weeks into the review, that the conclave had assigned our paper to a category called undetermined civilizational impact, a designation that places a research finding in a legal limbo, where it is neither confirmed as safe nor confirmed as dangerous, which means it is treated as dangerous by default. To move a finding out of undetermined status requires a unanimous recommendation from the reviewing panels that it poses no threat. Unanimity in a body that operates on consensus architecture is not difficult to achieve when the preliminary framing of the question has gone a particular way. See, 11,000 delegates do not arrive at 11,000 different conclusions. They arrive at one conclusion. Together, shaped by the framing they were given at the start. We had not been given the opportunity to provide the framing. The directorate had. Raised this in my 5th interview, with a panel that included 2 Verath physicists, a legal adjudicator, and 1 representative from the Southern Observation Authority, who said very little, but wrote continuously in a small notebook. I laid out the framing problem clearly, with references to the specific language used in the directorate's preliminary assessment, and I asked them to consider whether the initial framing might be producing a predictable result rather than an evaluated one. The panel's designated secretary noted my concern for the record, and that panel then asked me whether it was correct that the capability could be transmitted to other humans without the use of any technology or equipment that could be restricted. I said yes. The panel secretary noted this as well. I understood leaving that session that the question I'd been asked was more significant than the answer I'd given to it. They weren't asking because they didn't know. They were asking because they needed it confirmed in my own words, for the record, that the mechanism of transmission was human-to-human communication, which meant that no equipment restriction, no data seizure, no facility lockdown could prevent the capability from spreading as long as humans were allowed to speak to one another. They were building the argument for the protocol invocation. I was being invited to help them build it. I spent the rest of that evening writing out in careful longhand everything I would say in the remaining 6 interviews. I rewrote it 4 times. Maddie read the 4th draft and circled 2 places where I had been more accommodating than the data required, and 1 place where I had been more confrontational than the circumstances warranted. I revised accordingly. In each of the 6 remaining sessions, I told the truth. I did not soften it, and I did not frame it in the language the panels were using, because their language was built on a premise that the capability was a threat to be managed, that I did not share and would not validate. I told them what we had found. I told them what it meant. I told them what I believed would happen if the Galactic tried to contain it, not because I was threatening them, but because it was a factual prediction based on the mechanics of how information spreads through a population. Information that exists inside human minds is not data on a server. It does not live behind an encryption key. It does not stay inside a locked facility when the humans who carry it leave the facility to go home, to call their families, to have dinner with colleagues from other departments, to attend conferences, to write emails. You can lock the data. You cannot lock the knowledge. I told them this in 6 different sessions to 6 different panels. It was noted each time. The integrated assessment process continued. The conclusion it had been moving toward from the beginning was reached. After the protocol enforcement action began, and the designated researchers were placed under informational restriction, I went to see each of them personally. In the days before my transit designation arrived, not to tell them to violate the restriction. The restriction was legally binding, and I understood what violating it would cost them. I went because I thought they deserved to know, from someone who had been in every review session, what had actually happened in those sessions. I told them the framing problem. I told them what the panels had been building toward. I told them that the restriction was legally enforceable, but that the knowledge it was trying to restrict had been inside them since before the enforcement action, and would remain inside them after it, and that no piece of paper changed that. 2 of them cried. One of them, a physicist named Dr. Anders Holm, who had spent his career in underfunded obscurity, publishing careful work that nobody cited, laughed for almost a full minute. Then he composed himself and said, "So they can't actually stop it?" "No," I said. "They can slow it. They cannot stop it." He nodded very slowly, with the expression of a man filing something carefully away. "Go to the hearing," he said, "and don't waste the 12 minutes." I told him I planned to use 3. He laughed again. It was a good laugh. I kept it with me on the transit. During the 9 days of the transit, beyond the card practice and the calculations, I thought about the nature of the conclave's error. Not because I was angry about it. I was not mostly angry. I was something more like sad. In the specific way, you are sad when an institution that should know better demonstrates that it doesn't. The Verath are not a cruel people. The individuals I had dealt with throughout the review process were, nearly without exception, operating in complete good faith within the structures their civilization had built. Verath had been professional, and, I believe, genuinely uncertain about whether what the conclave was doing was right. The 12 abstentions at the Senate vote represented the outer limit of what the consensus architecture allowed as dissent, and 12 was historically remarkable. The error was structural. The conclave had built itself. 400 years, 47-member civilizations, the entire vast machinery of interspecies governance on a model of reality that treated the physical constants as closed questions, fixed, agreed upon, and not subject to revision. This is an understandable thing to build on. Fixed constants are extremely convenient for governance. They let you write treaties that will mean the same thing in 100 years that they mean today. They let you enforce agreements without worrying that the enforcement mechanisms will stop working if someone thinks at them wrong. They provide, in the word Verath used, stability. The problem with building civilization on fixed constants is what happens when the constants turn out to have a footnote. We were the footnote. We had been the footnote, apparently, for as long as we had existed. The universe had been trying to tell the conclave this for 8 months, in the form of anomalous scent sensor readings around human research facilities that had been logged as equipment variants. And the conclave's monitoring systems had dutifully filed the reports, and no one had connected them. 12 delegates in the Senate chamber had felt the weight of the unconnected data in some inarticulate consensus-percept way and abstained. The other 11,000 had voted with the ledger. The ledger was wrong. In the chamber, sitting on the foundational stone floor, in the too small chair during the working silence that followed my demonstration, I had time to think about what happens next. Not strategically. I had done the strategic thinking already, on the transit, and the strategy was complete, and being executed by Maddie and 23 colleagues back on Earth. What I thought about in the working silence was the longer shape of it. The generation that comes after. The species that does not grow up not knowing what it is. Rowan, she is 2. She will grow up knowing. She will grow up in a world where the physics we found in the kitchen is taught as a standard part of the curriculum in the same year children learn about electromagnetism and the laws of thermodynamics. She will grow up knowing that her nervous system is in a relationship with the fabric of reality, and she will know what that relationship is called, and she will know how to work with it deliberately, not as magic but as physics, as another domain of the real that humans map and use and pass forward. Do not know what that generation will be capable of that mine is not. I have ideas. Calculations I have been running since Reykjavik suggest some of them. Maddie's more recent work, which she will not let me discuss publicly until the paper is finished, suggests others. I will say, only that the quantum coherent substrate is not limited in scale, the way that some of our early models assumed, and that the implications of this for long-range applications are, by any conservative measure, significant. The conclave, when those implications become clear, will have another moment of reckoning. I expect they will handle it better, having had practice. Verath, who was elevated to senior adjudicator of the conclave's new multi-species physics review body 6 months after the stability hearing, has been preparing for it methodically. She is a thorough person. I have come to respect her considerably, which I would not have predicted during that first inspection visit. When she left the facility in 4 minutes, with the summary under her arm and the controlled alarm in her face. She came to visit us in Reykjavik last spring. Maddie showed her the kitchen. Verath stood in the middle of it for a moment, looking at the table where we had set up our makeshift documentation station. The space where 42 cards had floated in the early hours of a Tuesday morning. And then she looked at me. "This is where it began," she said. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would have abstained." I nodded. "I know," I said. "I know. The pot of plants is still on the windowsill." Maddie identified it eventually as a type of echeveria, which does in fact need less water than we'd been giving it. It's healthier now. It gets morning light. Some things just need the right conditions. They were always going to grow. They just needed to be in a place where the conditions were finally right. And someone finally noticed what they were. We noticed. That is what we did. We paid attention, and we wrote it down, and we trusted the process even when the process tried to bury us. Because the truth doesn't change when the process fails it. It waits. It is patient in the way that true things are always patient. It does not need the ledger's permission to be real. It is real. We are real. We noticed. There is one more thing I want to say about the chair. After the hearing, after Verath Vel's order to remain in custody, a Conclave facilities officer came to collect it from the chamber floor. I watched her, small, methodical, Verath, carry the chair out through the side access that the functionaries use, the one that doesn't cross the main floor. The chair was slightly dented along the left rear leg, where I had, apparently, been pressing my foot against it during the working silence without noticing. The officer looked at the dent and then looked at me, briefly, with the flat-faced neutral expression that I had not yet learned to read. Then she left with the chair. I thought about that dent for a long time afterward. I thought about it in the custody room and on the transit home, and occasionally since. There is something in it that I have not been able to fully articulate, though I've tried. Keats. It is something about the gap between the scale of what happens in a room and the evidence that remains afterward. 11,000 delegates. A vote that had already reshaped the terms of the relationship between two civilizations. A deck of cards in the air above the foundational stone floor. And a small dent in the left rear leg of a chair that was too narrow to begin with, pressed there by the foot of one human physicist who was doing his best to sit still while the universe figured out what to do with itself. That is probably the truest description of the whole thing. All of us. Best to sit still, while the universe figured out what to do with itself. Conclave, in their consensus architecture way. Maddie, in the Reykjavik apartment with her notebook and her pen. Me, in the kitchen, with a deck of cards in my grandfather's hands, moving through me like a long inheritance I hadn't known I was carrying. We were all just paying attention, paying very close attention. And what you find when you pay close enough attention is that the universe has been paying attention back. Has always been paying attention back, and had simply been waiting, with the patience of something that knows it has time, for us to notice. We noticed. The cards hang in the air, everything follows from that.